But where do the rumors about Gates go off the rails? He didn't cook up COVID in his home lab. He's not putting microchips into vaccines.
How do you know?
Right. Well, we know from the research on real conspiracies that the numbers of people involved are limited and that the objectives are narrow. Now, Epstein's abuses fit that profile, not to say there aren't hundreds, if not thousands of survivors, but the scope and the MO are pretty focused. You know, he's a financial con man who wanted to dominate women and girls and to create a network of power and influence around that. It's a pretty narrow focus. And to that extent, or to the extent that Bill Gates looked the other way and offered him PR tips, he's implicated in that, if the reporting is true. Now, does that have any bearing on him sending mosquito nets or polio vaccines to Africa? Only in the sense that big money weaves together both the abject and the good. So I'll end by mentioning that we've often noted the research on conspiratorial thinking that shows that being vulnerable to one theory increases vulnerability to believing in other theories. So if you're a 9/11 truther, you're going to be more susceptible to QAnon. Now, if we just do a thought experiment and imagine that Bill Gates is the world, I'm betting that the willingness to accept that he enabled Epstein might also predict an attraction to the belief that he wants to track people with microchips and vaccines or poison them. Because if the Epstein collusion or complicity is solid, the people who believed that from the outset are starting at, Gates is in the cabal kind of positioning. Now, if you didn't believe that, if you don't believe it, if you didn't want to believe it, if you didn't want to look at that, or if you say, oh, he just had a few pictures taken with Epstein, all of the rich people do that, it's just pictures. What is the person who is quite sure of their gut feelings going to say next? I think it's really possible that they have to expand the fictions out to Gates's network of influence because nobody believed or nobody took seriously a more central betrayal.
We continually, and in some ways in my next segment on anti-vaxxers and the trans community, we're going to get into a very similar issue with stories like this where people just think that everyone is monolithic, and if they're just evil, that's all that can possibly come out of them. Besides the conspiratorial thinking, which then creates stories and spins webs from there. But I was watching a segment of Katie Porter, a representative here in California, grilling a pharma executive the other day about the amount of money that they spend on R&D compared to the amount of money that they spent on stock buybacks and executive compensation and bonuses. And I've even said myself that, there's a good amount of money that goes into R&D. So it's not like pharmaceutical drugs can just be free. But even seeing the chart that she made, it was really eye-opening. It was like, Jesus. And I get the impulse to want to think, man, they just do everything wrong. And yet that still doesn't mean that the current vaccines aren't efficacious and they're not working, because we have data on that it is. And so when you say this entire story, it is completely possible that Gates had some relations with Epstein, more than what we know at this point. It's absolutely, there is evidence pointing to that. But how you get from there to microchipping vaccine is still the leap that's so disturbing in this story, and how people are just willing to buy into it.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that the disbelief in that scenario is like an invitation to elaborate into other areas, right? It's like, this very highly emotionally charged, extremely painful story that a very powerful man is implicated in is ignored, or it's deflected from, or it's dismissed, or somebody like me just doesn't look carefully enough. Like I didn't know that when I published in October that the New York Times had just flat out reported that he had visited dozens of times. I didn't know it was dozens of times, and that's like, so how do I make that mistake?
I hear you talking about both things, right? You're talking on the one hand about how when there are rumors or when there is some establishing evidence of something that is really not kosher and it gets poo-pooed or dismissed,
right,
that can drive people further into escalating their conspiracy rhetoric. But I hear you saying the other thing too, which is kind of what we referred to once as being blue-pilled, right? That there's a tendency to ignore certain facts because we associate them with something that we've already dismissed.
And that's just what happened last year. We have a great evidence with that with Andrew Cuomo. Mm-hmm. Or go back to Giuliani when he was America's mayor. Like there was plenty of corruption going on then, but events put them in the spotlight. So Cuomo steps up for a moment. You know, now they think that he might be making up to $5 million on his upcoming book about how well he did dealing with the vaccine, and we know that that's not true.
Right.
So yeah, that impulse on the blue-pilled aspect is real. And again, it just keeps going back to the fact of why we're not built for social media. Because there's no allowance for nuance.
I think to sort of really think through the possibility of somebody listening to that bonus episode and coming to a fork in the road with the content of this podcast is kind of disquieting to me because, a person could legitimately think, mm-hmm. oh, you are giving him a pass. You are avoiding known data about this guy that comes from your so-called legitimate journalistic sources. And so why are you going to look carefully at his, at his I don't know, big pharma connections? Why are you going to look? Why would I trust you mm-hmm. to look carefully at what he's actually done in Africa, which may or may not be true, but like, why should I trust you? Why should I trust you?
Especially if you're going to downplay the Epstein stuff and lean on the he was bullied, poor guy, and maybe he's neuroatypical.
Absolutely right, exactly. I mean, I stand by those applications or those attacks and overtones in the discourse around Bill Gates.
Yeah,
but it's just sort of there's a bit of unintentional misdirection that ends up happening there that ends up driving sympathy in one direction and not the other.
Well, maybe this is also a podcast of admissions,
right? Because
in my next segment, I've talked to you guys privately before because, Matthew, you're much more familiar with the transgender community than I am because I don't have too many people in that community. So I have never paid that much attention to it. But then I started to be like, well, there's some things I need to pay attention to. So let me educate myself. And my next segment is that, just like this is your segment being like, wow, I kind of overlooked that. So what more can you do than if you've kind of overlooked something and they go back and say, oh, I missed that. Let's explore it further. And I think that's healthy for society. It's healthy for individuals. I think the unhealthy aspect is coming to a conclusion and then refusing to ever change that conclusion.
For sure. And I think too, maybe what I'll just finish by saying is that I just want to reaffirm that some of the basic anxieties that we see expressed within the language of conspirituality and the social movements like QAnon, they're reasonable.
Yeah.
They are reasonable in terms of offering a critique of global surveillance capitalism and difficult to understand power structures that have an enormous amount of control or wield an enormous amount of influence over our lives that we can't understand. All of that, the instincts are right. The instincts are correct. They're understandable.
Yeah, and then sadly they are right, and then they get animated later by a kind of caricaturish, wild, fantastical notion that at the highest levels of power, somehow the most diabolical abuse is woven together into how people maintain power and wealth and influence in ways that it's too